So let's get started, and maybe Fred will come later and participate, because I expect that today this Ashis Nandy is our topic for today, and I think he is a very familiar figure in these parts. So one of the better known Indian intellectuals in this part of the world. And there is this whole translation of his essays to prove it. And we also have with us one of those who participated in the translation project, who will also make a presentation, giving us an understanding of this. So I'm looking forward to that. And today we also have Julian speaking about Dipesh Chakravarti a little later. After we go, so the two essays for today are the Ashis Nandy's essay, which is actually the book, the original book called The Intimate Enemy, consisted of two very long essays. So it was altogether about 120 pages or so. Each essay was 60 odd pages, and this is the first essay. So it's like half the book, what we have here. Psychology of Colonialism, Sex, Age and Ideology. And Dipesh Chakravarti has written a very short but very, very astute, acute sort of analysis of Ashis Nandy, which is a critical tribute, somebody who admires and appreciates Nandy's work, but has a certain critical outlook. So that's the textual material for today. A very popular columnist who was actually providing a lot of interesting cultural analysis of topical events, things that were going on in India, And it was a very unusual kind of writing. That's why it caught on, because nobody before that had attempted something like that. Just look at what is going on around you. There were attempts, but they were localized. So he would write on. There was a hijack. Two or three Sikh young people. They hijacked a plane. But they were very inept. They didn't have any big weapons. The whole thing ended as a fiasco. So he wrote an essay on that, and how these people were really just little young boys who were just trying to show their anger, and how the machinery of the Indian state was deployed and treating them as terrorists and so on. So it was those kinds of things. Then sati, that is the widows, the practice in Hinduism of widows being burnt at the funeral pyre of their husbands, which is an older practice which has a different kind of cultural meaning in the old days, but which has also obviously meant a certain amount of denial of agency, freedom to the woman, because it's at once coded as an honorable thing to do, and those who do it are treated as great women who are with a certain claim to the adoration of people, right? But at the same time, it was also a practice which was being used by the relatives of the deceased, dead person, to get rid of the wife who will otherwise claim the property. So this is the duality of it. At one level, if you look at the ancient stories, for instance, women who would rather die than be, than have their honor taken away by an invader, right? When a kingdom is conquered, the honorable women would just jump into wells, or otherwise die in the husband's funeral pyre, and all of these things as acts of both obviously fidelity, but also a question of honor. So it has different social periods. It's a different meaning. But by
choice. Huh? It's a choice.
the choice question, which is very difficult to determine whether choice has been actually exercised, right? Because you never know. I mean,
percentage. I mean, like 50 of the widow
yeah.
come to Sadi, or what? Is there a study?
No, but these are mostly historical examples that we have. So when the British came here into India, in the initial days of British rule, they used to actually, the East India Company people, they used to actually go around and try to stop sati from happening. This was one of the big things that for the British it was, it was like an adventure. They would be sitting in their office, somebody would come and say a sati is happening there, and they would rush there, and depending on their temperament, they would either watch it or prevent it, if they had the power and so on. Right? You may, if you have read Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, he actually stops the sati. When he's in India, it's happening and he stops it and he takes the woman with him and goes away. So it was a big deal those days. But in the 20th century, there have not been too many, sort of cases reported, but occasionally something. But in post-independence India, a few times these things happened. So in this, Nandy wrote about one such incident which happened in the 80s, that a woman in Rajasthan was burnt at the pyre of her husband, and left, feminist organizations took it up as something that should be addressed, punished, that the punishment should be meted out to those men who were involved in setting this about, because they were convinced, or at least they persuaded, that the woman was being coerced into committing it. Nandy wrote about it, and when we come to Dipesh, because Dipesh Chakravarti discusses that essay. So like that, there are many such topical issues that he took up. Secularism, what is secularism, why is secularism, and so on. And meanwhile, he actually starts off as a kind of psychometry student, psychometry. He actually wrote an early book which is very peculiar considering what he wrote later, in which he has all kinds of calculations of personality types, a little taking off from the Adorno, the authoritarian personality, which Adorno and they did a study called the authoritarian personality in just in the 40s or so, I think, which was this, again, a peculiar book in which they tried to provide some objective, measurable criteria and classification of personality types and so on. So he was in that. He then reads psychoanalysis. He starts collaborating to some extent with Sudhir Kakar, who is one of India's most well-known psychoanalysts. So he's doing this kind of work. So he starts interpreting Gandhi in psychoanalytic terms, which of course Erik Erikson wrote a book on Gandhi, but Ashis Nandy does another kind of thing. And so he builds up a huge reputation. And being in Delhi, in the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, he has a few things on his agenda, which is this whole project about the futures, alternative futures, right? So he then evolves as a kind of psychological critic of contemporary Indian culture, who adopts a position which is derived from Gandhi, substantially derived from Gandhi. That is, he adopts Gandhi's position on a number of issues, such as the nature of freedom, what it means to be free, whether it's British, what is genuine freedom, is it okay to use Western methods to fight Western rule, and so on. He has been a controversial figure because this essay on sati was something which angered many people. They thought he was defending sati itself. Like that, there is many essays. And the most recent one was not an essay, but a very flippant comment he made when he was actually in the most critical, most sort of dire situation, where he said something to the effect that lower caste people are more corrupt than upper caste people, or something like that. In a peculiar, twisted way, he was actually trying to compliment lower caste people in some way, which is to say that because he thinks corruption is a good thing in India, because through corruption the people, the weak in India, are able to get at least some relief from their misery. So in that context, he was trying to, he thought he was saying that there was, that the lower castes are more corrupt than the upper caste. But of course, this was, in a way, a very difficult kind of thing to say, for people to swallow. And so there was this kind of a couple of weeks, he was just, lambasted from every side. He got really badly bruised, intellectually speaking. But of course, he's very powerful. He had his supporters also. But anyway, so he is a controversial figure, also a figure known to be provocative, to say things to provoke people and so on. So in many ways, he sort of adopts a Gandhian position on many things, and also a Gandhian sort of demeanor. And when we come to Dipesh Chakravarti, we'll see what Dipesh is a very sympathetic reader of Nandy, and he is pointing to certain things which he thinks that Nandy should attend to. So we can discuss it later. So now we'll start with Karen's presentation. Okay, come.
So, yeah. So, I don't know how you find this book, but I think it's on the one hand fun, on the other hand also challenging. And if you look at the title, right, Psychology of Colonialism. So by the title, you can already kind of see that in this essay we are reading today, that Nandy, he seems to me to be trying to move away from the political economy of colonization to colonialism. Firstly, as a state of mind, right? And secondly, as a state of mind both in the colonizers and the colonized. So I think that part is pretty interesting and important, because throughout this essay, he would kind of emphasize these two parts, right? So he says something, right, that I have to apologize because I didn't use the version where there's page number. So what I did was, whatever I'm going to try to say, I put it on the page, okay? So, and then he says this in the first section, I quote, "The example I use shall be that of India, where a colonial political economy began to operate 75 years before the full-blown ideology of British imperialism became dominant. And by 35 years after the formal ending of the Raj, the ideology of colonialism is still triumphant in many sectors of life." So I think what you kind of see here is the idea and the theme of continuity of colonialism, right? It doesn't end just because it has formally ended. And Nandy wants to kind of argue that where can you locate this continuity? You can locate it in people's psychological state somewhat, right? Which reflects the title. And they are found not just in the ruled, right? But also the rulers. So he is trying to say something like, somewhat like Gandhi about the rulers. And yeah, so now when it comes to this psychological state, I think what is important here and why is this psychology a matter today is because for Nandy, he is trying to say that this psychological state is unique because it helps the rulers and the ruled deal with a kind of split, or a kind of contradiction that happens psychologically. So the contradiction here is that is something that we have been talking about, I think. So the contradiction is that how is it possible, right, that colonial systems inherently dominating and also governing by the rule of difference, right? You know, the Chatterjee's words, are built by societies that are ideologically supposed to promote a kind of open political system, liberalism and intellectual pluralism. So here there is a kind of contradiction that we kind of talked about, but he is trying to kind of locate it also in the psyche, right, in psychology. So so the question for Nandy throughout the essay, I feel, is how is this contradiction sustained within the states of minds of the rulers, you know, of the rulers and the ruled. So Nandy wants to argue, right, that there are certain inner rewards and punishments in the first section, right? He wants to argue that there are certain inner rewards and punishments that we should take note, or certain incentives and disincentives that motivates, okay, this submission to colonialism, right? And so, you know, so the whole idea in the first section that he wants to kind of break through is that colonialism doesn't end with formal political freedom. So it is a state of mind, and it has certain, and so he says this, that that which begins in the minds of men must also end in the minds of men. So I think this raises an important question to our understanding of colonialism and how the decolonization process can take place. So if you move on to the second sections of this essay, then to understand colonialism, right, the second kind of step that we have to understand it in relation to the internalization of Western notions of masculinity and femininity, right? So he adds an edge to colonialism, right? That there is this kind of sexual stereotypes that's at work, and he says that this is a kind of Western sexual stereotypes, right? And these sexual stereotypes are crucial to setting the basis or the grounds for political dominance. How so? Through the internalization of masculinity or purusattva, right, over femininity or naritva. So when you internalize this sexual hierarchy, right, the political dominance takes place through that process, right? So political dominance, what is unique in this section is that political dominance don't take place just through formally or through the law, but it happens also through the mind via sexual stereotypes. So so the idea here that Nandy wants to bring forth in the second section for me was that political dominance is achieved through the language of Western sexual stereotypes. And you will see that this is not, I think Nandy wants to bring out also a point that it doesn't happen throughout British rule, right? He says that most Britons in India in the past, right, at some point, still lived like Indians at home. And in the office, they wore Indian dress, they observed Indian customs and religious practices. And even the British Indian Army had to pay respect to Indian gods and goddesses. So the question is, when did this process of colonialism occur? And Nandy argues that it began when the Raj co-opted Western sexual and political stereotypes or the language and used it against the Indians, thus beginning to see Indians as a kind of barbarians who need to civilize themselves. So what is happening here is that, you know, the Raj and many Indians appropriated this kind of psychological framework of seeing the British as, like, you know, sort of like agents of progress, and, you know, saw the salvation from their kind of barbaric or savage state, either by becoming more like the British, meaning that you kind of have to go through a process of identification with the aggressor. So you identify with the aggressor, or you can act against this framework that you internalize. How so? Maybe something like anti-colonial, but you do so, and even if you do so, to a certain extent, you still identify with that thing, that framework that you are rejecting, right? So you are still playing that same game, right? In the second section, we see Nandy kind of talking about how Western stereotypes work through Indian idioms or Indian concepts of purusattva, masculinity, naritva, and klibadva. I think this is interesting, right? Because it refers to a certain hermaphrodism. To me, it refers also to a certain androgyny. And so this klibadva, I think, or certain femininity in
masculinity, right, begins to be seen, as pathological, opposed to a certain undifferentiated purusattva or masculinity. So the thing is that I think Indians began to internalize this hierarchy, right? Pure masculinity over a certain, klibatva, right? He gives the example of this pre-Gandhian protest movements would aim to redeem Indians' masculinity, right? Because you internalize this goodness of pure masculinity by defeating the British through showing them that, you are more masculine. Indians are more masculine than the British. So the problem, I think, is that it already, in a way, presumes an internalization of this hierarchy. And I think that the key thing here is also that when you're using the logics that inhere within these conceptual ideals, right, or these hierarchies, so you use it in a way to psychologically justify colonial domination. So he says this in sections 2, I think towards the end, that colonial rulers had themselves to build bulwarks against a possible sense of guilt produced by a disjunction between their actions and what were till then, in terms of important norms of their own culture, true values. On the other hand, their subjects could not collaborate on a long-term basis unless they had some acceptance of the ideology of the system, either as players or counter-players. This is the only way they could preserve a minimum self-esteem in a situation of unavoidable injustice. So I think here, here is somehow it kind of works, right? It works as a kind of psychological bulwarks, so that the rulers themselves do not feel guilty for doing certain things towards the Indians that are supposed to be injustice, right? So certain psychological barriers had to be put up. And if you kind of move on to section 3, colonialism, the second way in which it kind of works, argues Nandy, is not only through the sexual stereotypes, right? It also has to kind of work through a notion of childhood. So the two things come in play, right? The concept of childhood is kind of rather interesting. I found that in the reading of this essay in sections 3, Nandy adopts Philip Aries's understanding of the child. So before the 17th century, according to Philip Aries, the child is only a smaller version of the adult. But the modern concept of the child had a new dimension here, because the modern concept of the child has the notion of inferiority, right? And the child becomes an inferior version of the adult, not just smaller, but also inferior, that has to be educated through childhood. And I think this is, for Nandy, somewhat like a blank slate where adults have to teach, right? Because it's inferior, and you have to teach moral, productive, ethical codes to save the child from a certain state of savage sinfulness or something. So Nandy kind of argues that what colonialism did was to draw parallels here between childhood and primitivism, as earlier stages of the axis of growth along progress and development. So, and of course, the Indians, they're not located at the upper ends, they are located at the lower ends, right? They were connoted to children. So Nandy says two things here. So there can be childlike Indians, the childlike Indians who are innocent, right? But they are willing to learn, and they are masculine, so they can be reformed through westernization, through Christianizing. But they are childish Indians. So there are two different, right? Childlike and childish. So the childish Indians, these are the people who are unwilling, ignorant to learn, and ungrateful, and they must be repressed through the rule of law. But both of these childlike and childish Indians, Nandy says, they still cohere, within a kind of partnership that sustains British culture and economic and political world. So from this, what you can see, I think, for me, is that age has a very important part to play in British colonialism. Firstly, right, so one of the things you will see is that British colonialism functions within, when you have that kind of conceptualization of age, it functions, to make, the elderly. So it kind of affects the elderly. It makes the elderly who, can be someone who represents wisdom, right? Because as you age, you know more. But no, because of this concept of age, now the elderly are socially irrelevant because, of the lower physical power. They could not contribute to economic productivity within this framework of age. So, Nandy kind of at this point, he brings up an enigma, which is how can a civilization like India, with their traditions of 4,000 years of civic living and a developed literary tradition, be colonized within these frameworks of inferiority and savagery? I think this is a very interesting enigma, right? So how did it take place? And so here, the age temporality concept that the Western colonizers, the British brings, comes into the fold in a different way, right? This is on a more broader framework, general, more abstract framework. Okay, it posits civilized India as the past, the bygone past, and the present India as no longer related to this past. So we are seeing time on a different scale here, right? So present India is no longer related to that civilized past. So the idea is that now India is degraded and colonial culture, right, the British has to come in and improve this degraded India. So I think section 3 kind of talks about this and raises very interesting question on how age and how temporality here works, And if you move on to sections 4, then I think Nandy now wants to talk about people, okay, figures like Madhusudan Dutt, right, who wrote the Bengali epic. I have not read the epic, so the epic Meghnavad, okay, which in a way for him reordered. Okay, Nandy wants to now talk about how these authors or these people reordered Indian culture to fit within these colonial categories. Okay, and Nandy tells us that Madhusudan was, he as a person in his everyday life, he was flamboyantly westernized in his lifestyle and ideology and embraced the Church of England's version of Christianity. So this guy, Meghnavad, okay, in this Bengali epic, okay, there are two sacred figures here. And Nandy wants to use this to kind of show that Madhusudan would end up showing his admiration for this other sacred figure, right, who is the demon, Ravana. Okay, so Ravana's masculine vigor, right, and accomplished warriorhood, okay, Ravana's masculinity and secularism would be accepted, admired in this text, okay, by Madhusudan, right, and he would take it as normal and adult, and as opposed to the other sacred figures. So two figures are kind of counterposed. Rama, okay, Rama, who is here posed as effeminate and weak. So here you will see what Nandy is trying to talk about as the kind of internalization of sexual stereotypes at work, right? So how in the end Madhusudan kind of portrays Ravana's masculinity as something good, right? And another thing that I think is important in section 4 is that Nandy kind of points out that Madhusudan, okay, is to also kind of represent and talk about a different concept of tragedy, which is a Western concept according to Nandy. So one where Madhusudan in his text and in the novel, right, wrote. It kind of shows, right, in this, the concept of tragedy is where, number one, good and evil are clearly separated, and number two, evil, which is the demonic masculinity, wins in the end. So Nandy says that, if you really look at the Puranic tradition, right, tragedy isn't defined this way, where there is a clear distinction of good and evil. So he says that tragedy in the Puranas did not center around a grand final defeat or the death of the hero, or around the final victory of the ungodly. Tragedy lay in the majestic sweep of time and in the unavoidable decline or decay that informed the mightiest and the humblest, the epochal and the trivial, and the permanent and the transient. So, you know, when you put the two notions of tragedy together, you can see what Nandy is trying to show. Okay, Nandy is trying to show that Madhusudan was using, in fact, importing a different kind of Western notion of tragedy, right? And also, you know, you can see Nandy is trying to show that these authors like Madhusudan was trying to explain the West in Indian terms and to incorporate the West in Indian culture. So, and also he kind of talks about other people, other writers like Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. So, and I think this Bankim Chandra Chatterjee is where you can kind of see what Nandy is trying to talk about more clearly, right? Because here Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, you know, Nandy says, tried to kind of rebuild a notion of Krishna, right? Krishna, from a soft, childlike, self-contradictory god, right? He's somewhat sexually playful and androgynous into a kind of respectable, righteous, didactic heart god that protects the glories of Hinduism and whose role is to preserve an internally consistent moral and cultural system. So you can see the rebuilding and the reinterpretation of Krishna, okay, in Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. And, you know, so the idea again is that Bankim Chandra Chatterjee has reinterpreted the sacred text within a kind of colonial progressive worldview. And of course, you know, there's other people whom Nandy kind of talks about in this section, which is Swami De, Anadan, Saraswati, and Swami Vivekananda, right? Who also, you know, kind of wrote about Hindus as if they lost their greatness and, you know, they have lost a certain notion of masculinity, perhaps, you know, somewhat in my reading related to Kshatriyahood. Maybe, yeah, Kshatriyahood and and textual Brahmanism. Okay, so so this both of these people, they tried to Christianize Hinduism and also, you know, again adopting that kind of linear causal history and temporality. So so again, what can we get from this section? I think it's kind of, again, the effects of this on the psyche. Okay, so here Nandy says this: it allowed Western cultural ideas to percolate to the deepest levels of Hindu religious ideas and accepted Western cultural theories and political subjugation and economic backwardness. This newly created sense of linear history in Hinduism, an internalized counterpart of Western theory of progress, was an imperfect instrument for this purpose. It allowed one to project history, the sense of inferiority vis-a-vis an imperial faith, and to see the golden age of Hinduism as an ancient version of the modern West. So you can see, you know, I think Nandy's own view is definitely that such models are not adequate, right? As not an adequate basis for a human being's basic self-esteem and cultural autonomy. So I mean, of course, there are kind of other exceptions that Nandy mentions, like Gandhi and Iswa Chandra Vidya Saga. Okay, but I don't think I will discuss them here. But as you move on to section 5, okay, you will see that Nandy starts to kind of talk about something else, not too different, but what he calls the cultural and psychological pathologies produced by colonization in colonizing societies. Okay, so and you know, I think in this section this is interesting because to illustrate this point, he starts to talk about this example given by Fanon. Okay, so the example is where the police officer. This example is of the police officer who, as he tortured the freedom fighters in Algeria, became violent towards his own wife and children too. So, Nandy gives this kind of example to talk about the effects on the psychology of the person, right? And the idea here is that whatever the officer did to the freedom fighters, he had to, in a way, do it to himself too, and do it within his family. So, again, Nandy through this section talks, wants to say that the experience of colonizing cannot leave the internal colonizers of the British untouched. Okay, so to illustrate this point, he talks about two things. So number one is the colonial concept of class hierarchy, right? So that's amenable to industrial capitalism, applies to the British society too. And number two, okay, when British colonialism emphasizes on masculinity, competition, achievement, control, productivity in the public sphere, it downplays femininity, and this affects women in Britain too. So, somewhat, if we kind of recall our discussion on Gandhi, I think Gandhi also makes reference to the colonizers, right? So, I think Nandy does the same thing, okay? So, yeah, and another thing that he wants to kind of put forth is that the ideology of colonialism, okay, produces a false sense of cultural homogeneity in metropolitan Britain, right? It hides social divisions between the working classes. And number two, okay, I think he mentions this kind of in passing, but the ideology of colonialism, the effects of this is also that it displaces social divisions, tensions and violences from the metropolitan Britain, the heart of the British Empire, to the colonies, okay, such that the colonies here acts as safety valves for modern society, where individuals can, somewhat transfer the kind of, tensions and violent tendencies to the colonies, right? Maybe you go there and you do certain things. So I think he doesn't elaborate on this point too much, but it's interesting. So, but yeah, but what is important here is also that for Nandy, right, it's not colonialism or imperialism is not just a political position, but also it has a certain religious cosmology to it, a kind of ethical and religious sense. So, okay, but what is most important in this section, okay, is that Nandy begins to talk about figures like Rudyard Kipling, George Orwell, Oscar Wilde, Charles Freer Andrews, okay, and also others like Sister Nivedita, who, kind of responded in different ways to colonialism, right, and in their personal and everyday life. But I think what we kind of have to discuss later on is that is Nandy's method of talking about cultural pathology, is Nandy's method of talking about cultural pathologies, and how Nandy maps changes in the history of British colonialism to personal lives of these figures, showing the inner drives and elements of the private conflict that can be a response to a part of a broader political culture and broader political climate, right? I think we need to take note that this is a method of talking about cultural pathologies, a method which Nandy at the last section of this essay, kind of makes a mockery out of. He says this. Maybe I'll go there later. But he says this. Did Nandy really construct human nature and society the way I have described it? Or is mine a second order construction, a secondary elaboration? So this is a method that I think we kind of have to try to talk about. But if we go back to these figures that Nandy wants to talk about in section 5, okay, Rudyard Kipling, I think it's very interesting. So Kipling, so again, why we are talking about these figures is because we are trying to see how Nandy wants to show us the kind of psychological battles, right? So Nandy talks about Rudyard Kipling. So Kipling was for Nandy someone who was a tragic figure, right? Seeking to disown his self-hatred aspect of his Indianness, which he connotes to femininity and childhood, right? So throughout Kipling's life, he would want to disown and expel that part of his Indianness, his childishness, So you will see that in Kipling. When you will see a different response when you come to George Orwell, right? So Orwell is kind of different from Kipling, right? So Orwell kind of struggled with these colonial ideologies more outrightly, more verbally, right? Kipling is kind of like implicit, he fights with it, he battles with it through his personal life, and when his child died or something, and that took a worse end. But Orwell struggled with this colonial ideology differently. He was more open, right? He wrote critiques of the ideologies of oppression. So Orwell, somewhat like Kipling, was also born in India and brought up almost entirely in England. So since young, Orwell would kind of demonstrate his ambivalence towards maleness and the culture of hypermasculinity. He just didn't fit in there, right? Nandy says that Orwell was brought up in a women's world and so felt handicapped by ideas of asceticism, sexual puritanism, hard work, sportsmanship, and Orwell would even wet his bed. So, in a way, all these things immediately place him outside of colonial middle-class patriarchal ideologies and worldview, right? And you will see the same thing, right, in Oscar Wilde, right? Oscar Wilde, the homosexuality of Oscar Wilde, right, became automatically kind of, it's a struggle, right? And it is also against the colonial conventions of heterosexism, having clear man-woman relationships. But what is key here is that colonial culture was in India emphasizing the antinomy, strict opposites between Prusattva, masculinity, and Klibatva, right? So a kind of hermaphrodism or androgyny. And this, the effect of this is that it marginalized strands of Klibatva consciousness, right? From all these authors that we've been talking about, Rudyard Kipling, George Orwell. So it marginalized these strands of ambiguity, right? It is no longer able to tolerate Klibatva, androgyny, from the Indian consciousness. So Nandy is trying to use these figures to kind of talk about this process where ambiguity has to be kind of kicked aside, pushed out. So and so if you move on to the second last section, right, 5-6, section 6 of this essay, Nandy starts to begin, right, to read Gandhi and interpret Gandhi as a form of what he calls, open close inverted commas, transcultural protest against the hyper-masculine worldview of colonialism, right? And what is important here is for me that Gandhi himself, his love, Gandhi himself seems to be an embodiment of in his everyday life. It's an embodiment of that kind of protest, right, against the hyper-masculine colonialism. And Gandhi was a symbol of that kind of androgyny that has to be kind of kicked out of the kind of Indian consciousness. So, Nandy talks about Gandhi's love for some of the Christian hymns and biblical texts, and Nandy's critical attitude towards sportsmanship, which you can also find in this section, and also his stance, right, his pacifism. This is something that's really opposite to Western aggressiveness. And so, in Nandy's writing, this becomes a symbol of negation or androgyny, right? So Gandhi's non-violent stance, which he made as central Hindu or Indian virtue, for instance, is not borrowed from the sacred texts of it's not borrowed from the sacred texts of India, but from somewhere else, from a Western source, right? But Gandhi still takes it and and makes it a central virtue of Hinduism or Indian virtue. So Nandy reads this, right, as a kind of a symbol, embodiment of this kind of ambiguity, this kind of mixing, transcultural mixing. So Yeah, but what is more important is also, Gandhi. So what Gandhi does, okay, in Nandy's reading is also to reverse the order of sexual hierarchy, right? So we'll move. So I kind of put it here, right? So in the colonial British way of looking at the sexual hierarchy, again we have Purusattva, manliness, Naritva, womanliness, and Klibatva, androgyny. So according to this hierarchy, the Klibatva is androgyny is the worst, right? Femininity in men, that's the worst. So and Gandhi, okay, would come in and he would say two things, or he would make two reorderings. Okay, he would say number one, that manliness and womanliness are equal, but the ability to transcend both manliness, Purusattva, and Naritva, the man-woman dichotomy, androgyny, okay, is superior. Okay, so you will see Gandhi kind of reversing this order. So androgyny in Gandhi's kind of reordering and reconceptualizing becomes, right, godly, sanely, better, more, takes on a higher hierarchy position than the kind of Western, the Western way of hierarchizing sexual stereotypes, right? So, and number two, here, the essence of femininity, okay, so the second reordering that Gandhi makes is that the essence of femininity, so Naritva, is superior to masculinity, and both are superior to cowardice, so the failure of masculinity, which he calls Kapurusattva. Okay, so two reorderings he makes here. One is that androgyny is better, right, higher than everything else, and the second one is that Naritva, right, femininity is superior to masculinity, so superior to Purusattva, and femininity is also superior to cowardice, failure to act, failure of masculinity. So I think these reorderings that Nandy reads in Gandhi is very fascinating. I think what it does then is to give back some power to the feminine principle, right, which is really against the kind of British colonial masculinity and aggressiveness that we saw in the previous sections. So, and he gives the feminine principle to the men, who embodies a certain sense of femininity. So in a way, Gandhi, maybe if you read it in this way, gives back some sense of self-worth to Rudyard Kipling, who for his whole life tried to expel his femininity, his Indian side, So, so when Naritva, right, the principle of womanliness becomes kind of linked to the Gandhi's notion of non-violence, okay, Gandhi's philosophy of being in India, Nandy argues that also adopting this state of non-violence, which carries the principle of womanliness, Naritva, gives men access to protective maternity and a sense of God-like state of Arhanarishvara. Yes. So yeah, half men, half woman, androgynous. So so for Gandhi, for me, right, and here, you see that activism and action, maybe in the public sphere, courage, cannot be sought from the manliness of British colonial import. But what happens here is that you need to look to Naritva, womanliness, right, a kind of androgyny and womanliness for that kind of power, inner power to kind of act. So, through this, the Western concept of manliness used to civilize others becomes seen as something pathological and bad. So I think Nandy's reading of Gandhi here is kind of important in the reversing of this entire hierarchy that we are trying to establish, right, of the British colonial import. So, in the kind of last section, Nandy would kind of begin to talk about the subject of history, right, which is again related back to age and temporality and childhood that we kind of talked about earlier on. So in, I think the last section, section 7, right, here in second last section, Nandy argues that Gandhi rejects history and places myths over history. So there's another thing that Gandhi does, right, which is that he places myths over history and so circumvents or moves away from the linear time, right? So because history in the Western idea for Nandy, right, it takes on a kind of rational mode, and also it takes on a linear form. So from a primitive state, you evolve to a modern state. And you attain political adulthood, you know. So that kind of mode, right? So what is interesting is that you know, for Gandhi, Nandy's reading of Gandhi, okay, we must be clear here. So Nandy's reading of Gandhi is that Gandhi becomes someone who again reverses this, right? This linear history. So for Gandhi, the past is a sort of an open present. So past is a sort of open present, and it is also a special case of the present. So even in the present, right, not just linear, even in the present, you can have competing past, which is open to being remade with the past. And so the present can be a certain form of a new past, and the future is always open to a remaking of the past. So it's different from a Judeo-Christian cosmology, right, taken on by Marx. So in that version, right, I kind of bolded it here. Prehistory, the version is prehistory to a kind of objective stage-bound history. You have class struggles, false history, false consciousness, and then history as ideology, and then you have an end of history. Right? For Gandhi, this entire movement becomes, in a way, blurred. Right? The past is always open, and yeah, but you know, Nandy notes that this is not something that originates in Gandhi, because he notes here that you can see it in the poetry of T.S. Eliot, you can see it in Jurgen Habermas's concept of future-oriented memories and so on. But Gandhi does this. Okay, so yeah, so I think that's important, right? So and you know, kind of lastly, okay, another idea that in this section Nandy wants to bring forth is also that myths themselves, myths themselves are kind of a part of the essence of culture, and also a part then of history. So myths constitutes history, and they are not to be seen as outside of history, used by children or savages, or seen as flawed, right? Because Nandy wants to bring out the point here, that myths, right, are also how Indians used to constitute and structure their present, their here and now. So the whole concept of history, right, as rational Western, that for Nandy excludes myths, but Gandhi here tries to do something with this kind of myths versus history. The idea is that cultures that lives by myths are not history. They are ahistorical. They are cast away as second-rate social consciousness. So people in India who live their lives by myths are living in an earlier time like children, not yet adults like British. So they're not yet adults like the British. So, but I think what you can kind of draw from here is that the idea of history as separate or disjunct from myth and history, clear-cut breaks, right? Is break with the past is, a way of colonizing the consciousness. So for Nandy, right? So I think Gandhi here becomes a person who stands for a sense of continuity with the past, a kind of blurring, right? And myths that structure a lot of the Indian consciousness kinds of takes on an important role, right? In structuring the here and now. So I think, reading this entire piece of essay, right, which is fun and fascinating, But I think the question we need to kind of raise is that is what he kind of talks about. So Nandy says this, okay, at the end of this essay. He says, did Gandhi really construct human nature and society the way I have described? Or is mine a second-order construction, a secondary elaboration, as a psychoanalyst may prefer to call it, which imputes to a man a new structure in the manner of India's traditional commentators, persons and texts? So perhaps, he says, so first he raises this question, and next he says, perhaps the question is irrelevant, as Gandhi so effortlessly demonstrated. For those seeking liberation, history can sometimes be made to follow from myths. So I think this is a fascinating end off for this essay. So I don't know if the question is irrelevant, but I think it's worth discussing. Yeah.
Shall we have comments also?
I have 4 comments about the Ashis Nandy's essay, and because of my poor English, so I will speak Chinese later, and my teacher will help me to translate. Okay. 第一点我想要讲的那个 comment， 第一个就是说，其实在那个另外一个那个 critical 的那篇文章，他有讲到说，其实传统它既是文化创新的资源，它也有它黑暗病理学的一面。另外，传统是一种不断变动的一种传统。Ashis Nandy他身为一个，就我而言，我觉得他身为一个批判的传统主义者，其实他继承了某种印度知识的传统。其实在在那篇文章跟那个 critical 的那篇文章都可以看得到。比如说，他在那个殖民主义心理学谈到一个人，就是 Ishwar Shadra， 我不知道怎么念。他说，其实那个人呢，他看到了新都信仰它本身的内在矛盾，他也努力要保护的就是新都信仰的精神，而不是结构。第二点呢，就是他看到了塔戈尔呢的多位的知识分子，他对于那个萨体所持有的那种双重多元的二元性的那样的态度。另外，他也看到了甘地，他用神话和文本而拒斥了西方线性主义的历史观。他认为过去跟当下不存在真正的断裂，而表现出的是一种对未来是新的过去的新的一种宿命论。所以由这个3个人，我们也可以看到说，其实南帝他其实他是继承了这一路的知识传统。这是第一个 comment。
Begin citing the tradition is not something only to be remade as a creative forces, but also pathological, and it's constantly changing. Right? And I think the key she's making here is that Nandy is part of the intellectual tradition. He's moving along, and so she's citing the different, example. The first person being but mainly taking the spirit of him, but also Tagore from the Sati, and also from Gandhi against the linear understanding of history. So this is the critical traditionalism what Ashis Nandy is taken from, basically.
然后第二点的话，就是从那殖民主义心理学里面的那本书可以看到，其实呢，殖民主义它改变了殖民者跟被殖民者他原本文化的优先顺序。然后我们也看到甘地他试图要把印度被排挤而且被边缘化的文化再推到中间来。那他用的方法呢，就是印度跟英国的相互参照。他让传统的英国跟传统的印度在现代之外相遇。这不仅是政治的，也是道德的。他一方面呢给予传统新的文化意涵，另一方也否定了殖民文化的根本基础。这是第二点。
Colonialism changes the cultural priority. already existing, right, inside the both societies for both colonized and colonized, and reverse or reconfigure the priority and hierarchy. So Nandy proceed to use India and England as a reference system to each other in terms of the tradition and the modern, and to show that. So even my understanding of her point is that none of his point Nandy is making is essentialized in England, no. But the tradition of elements of the tradition of the English culture gets replayed in the modern time. And then in relation to India, at least the example we were giving earlier, right, how things are changing, different priorities are made in this process, but point is already changing, both the colonized and colonized cultural system.
然后第三点我想要讲的就是说，Nandy 呢，他其实把 Sati 他放到一个文化或神话或文本的一个传统中，看见它丰富的那个意义。然后他反对的是一种西方线性的一种历史观，因为这西方线性的历史观是什么样的历史观呢？它是很强调目的性的，它是很有目的性的，它为了是要建构出西方现代性的一种图像。那其实对我而言，我还是非常的关心，那你要怎么样看什么才是历史的客观性呢？如果线性历史观没有办法看到历史，那你要怎么样才能真正看到历史呢？是否有其他的视野跟方法可以来面对我们自己的历史？然后在我以前读的东西的话，面对历史这样的东西，有一个历史学家，就日本的历史学家宫口雄三，可以提供我们一些认识论跟方法论来谈历史，就是那是一个可以提供另外一个思考的面向，就是对他而言，他认为说，你必须要空着双手进入历史，然后让历史事件呢依着它内在的动力来自行组合，而不是依照历史学家的目的而任意选取的。那你用这样的方法来看待历史的话，可能就不会像西方一样用线性历史观的目的性的论来看历史。
Nandy using the notion of sati and based on myth as kind of cultural text, right? In order to oppose the linearity of Western view of history, which has its own purpose and teleology. But for her, the question still is, then what is the objectivity of history? What sort of methodology can we develop to approach history? So she's citing the Japanese historian, so could you use those notions? We enter history empty-handed, so without presuppose the teleology and the purpose, but let the historical driving force to take over in order to realize what history was about.
然后对一个是我自己的问题，就是说，如果我看这个东西，我透过印度和台湾的相互参照，我可以看到些台湾的什么东西？就是比如说，就印度而言，印度它是英国殖民了长达了190年，然后在统治者离去之后呢，殖民时期的各种的组织跟生活方式还是仍然持续着。然后就某种程度而言呢，Nandy对于那个萨提的这个发言呢，其实也是在对殖民意识形态进行一种抗争，所以这个殖民意识形态是延续到现在的。那就台湾呢？那台湾的话，我们可以看到说，台湾它是被同为东亚的日本殖民了50年。然后呢，这个日本呢，它在地理上而言，它并不是西方的，但是在心理上而言，它又认为自己是西方。然后在第2次世界大战日本投降，台湾归还中国以后呢，这个没有被殖民经验的国民党流亡政府，他在统治的初期，则是力图的想要铲除台湾人民的被殖民的记忆，比如说语言转换的问题。那这些殖民跟国民党统治的这些记忆呢，又延续到现在，成为台湾现在的统独省级问题。 我觉得这个东西互相对照，可以看出一些我们自己跟印度不一样的一些东西，然后这也是我们必须要去面对的一些课题。
What can be learned from this contrast between India and Taiwan in terms of the colonial experience? So after 190 years colonization by England, at the end of it, there is still continuity, sort of colonial ideology. So even Nandy, using the notion of sati, is actually to contest the existing in the post-colonial moment with colonial ideology. Then, with reference to that, Japan wasn't geographically the West, but somehow psychically seeing itself as part of the West, or connecting to Europe. And when KMT landed here, it's attempted to shift the colonial memory through, let's say, language policy and so on. But somehow there is still certain elements of a continuity still configuring in the present moment, which constitute Taiwan's political and ethnic politics. So she ended up trying to say maybe from the learning from the Indian experience we can, have different views on how Taiwan evolved.
Thank you. Excellent. Yeah, the last two questions are actually what I think what interests me most about what you've raised. This history question, which will come up again in Dipesh's critical comments, and we know that Dipesh Chakravarti has definite views about this history question since we read him last time. And this Japanese historian's idea is something I would like to know more about, because obviously in this back and forth between history and myth that happens in Nandy's text, there is some confusion. It's not a clear-cut, sort of choice, saying, okay, I'm only going to think mythically or something. There's no evidence of mythical thinking in Nandy. It's more of a, maybe Gandhi, you can say what Nandy says about Gandhi is that he has in some ways locates himself in a mythical kind of discourse. Perhaps that can be seriously considered, but Nandy himself is, in spite of that last paragraph that Karen read, that where he tries to sort of basically confound the whole thing and leave it sort of unanswered, there is some serious problem that we need to discuss, which is that what does it mean to even make a choice between these two things? And if you're not actually wanting to make a choice so much as say be critical of historical discourses, which is obviously a legitimate enterprise, because the discourse of history has not always been sort of in some there have been problems with it, and there are many critical views about it. So perhaps one interesting way to ask this question, I don't know what as I said, the Japanese scholar historian does, is to ask how the historical discourse might be actually then theoretically infused, inflected with some new elements by the colonial experience, which of course, in a way Nandy is answering that question. What he is saying is, well, bring myth back into it or something like that, isn't it? So that's I would like to know more and see how that works out. I mean, what all of us might think about that question. And as for this issue of Taiwan's whether, in other words, I think what you are suggesting is through certain measures like the language policy, the attempt was made to wrench Taiwanese consciousness out of this colonial continuum into some independent existence, right? Autonomy. Well, that's precisely the definition of freedom, if you like, right? That is exactly what constitutes freedom. But at the same time, it is not to say that this break is a clean break which completely eliminates all continuities, right? So in that sense, so I think what you're suggesting is that this Indian example sort of provokes, stimulates an inquiry into whatever continuities there may be in the Taiwanese situation. And in fact, there was a paper that I heard in Tainan, which is about film, which was making this point about this turning the gaze towards Japan, which is happening in Taiwan. This argument was based on a particular film called Cape Number 7, and saying that, and saying that there is some tension between a mainland-oriented, mainlandward gaze, which is one, and a kind of restoration of a Japanward sort of gaze of anticipation or something like that, which obviously must have something to do with the continuities that you were mentioning. But I think also at the same time, it's really a question of the balance between continuity and change, right? Because one of the points that Nandy makes in this about, when it comes to the history and myth section, is a very strong point about the difference between India and the West, hinging on the emphasis, the tilt in favor of either disruption, discontinuity, break versus continuity. So in other words, he says the West is used to thinking about revolutions all the time. So the idea of revolution is that you just break with the past and you institute something new. There's a break, there's a disruption, there is a gap between past and present. So to that he contrasts what he considers the Indian sort of way of thinking, where continuity is the dominant. So nothing changes finally. There are some breaks, but they get reabsorbed into the continuity. So he gives the example of the Bhakti movement. So it's an interpretation. I mean, it's not truth. The Bhakti, you can say that when an attempted break fails, it gets reabsorbed into continuity, right? So, I mean, that's one way of thinking about it, right? The other way to think about it on the Western side is to say that every break, however clean and however completely comprehensive the break may be, after the break there is a kind of reappropriation of the past in such a way as to constitute a continuity. But it's a new continuity established from the position of the present of the break, right? So in that sense, there is this balance between breaks and continuity is obviously a very crucial issue. See, there is a history, as you said.
Yeah.
There is a history of a different, things changing as you move from the 19th century to the 20th century.
Yeah.
Now, what is the nature of that change? There is no doubt. And these figures whom he cites, they are key figures. All right? But you may remember that in the earlier classes, I introduced another way of mapping the change, which is from a substantially social preoccupation in the 19th century to a shift into political freedom, the priority of political freedom in the 20th, which coincides with roughly 20th century And the first moment of this transition is the terrorists, the extremists. And then Gandhi, in some ways, sort of synthesizes the social and the political dimensions, which have sort of followed one after the other into a concrete program. But in his program itself, the political begins to dominate. So there is actually a clear flow, even within Gandhi's writings. In fact, very interestingly, in the 20s, 1920 or 21, a Dalit, in those days they did not call themselves Dalit, but a representative of Tamil untouchable castes, whom he calls suppressed castes. He writes to Gandhi and says, look, you used to say that if we change society, freedom will come automatically. And you used to agree with people like Tagore, who say these things, that the first priority is society. But now, that is in 1920, Gandhi reverses the priorities and makes political freedom the absolute necessity, and social questions subordinate to that program. That is, this, once we get free, we will take care of these problems. That shift happens. So there is that shift in Nandy's reckoning. What he does is, he reads that history in terms of the masculinity sort of trope, right? So what happens then is, he actually leaves out those arguments. For instance, Vidyasagar, whom he cites very favorably. Now, Vidyasagar is a social reformer, essentially. And that's why in fact, his comment on Vidyasagar is, he was not able to convert his ideas into a political program. But that's because in the 19th century, nobody thought of a political program other than in social terms, right? But say Ranade, the liberals, the 19th century, essentially everywhere in India you have this position. In the 20th century, there are only two people among the big leaders or big figures of national movement. Only two figures continue to insist on this social priority. One is Tagore, the other is Ambedkar. Everybody else moves into this program of political freedom. Now, within that, yes, you can say that people like Bankim, people like Tilak, people like Vivekananda, these people represented a particular type of response, and he is right about it. That a response which said, look, we are weak, we've lost the battle, because we are weak. And in fact, Swami Vivekananda, he says, beef is what we need. Beef, biceps, he says beef, biceps and something else is the need of the, So basically all these are, the reference is also to Gandhi, right? Because Gandhi in his childhood, he had this Muslim friend who told him, look, you people, you are so effeminate, you are so weak, that's because you eat only vegetarian food. So Gandhi actually eats meat and then has his whole, crisis of conscience, and he then has to confess to his mother and get purified and all those things. Because it's one option, isn't it, to think that there is something of a inherent weakness, and that weakness can be interpreted in many ways. Some people interpreted it as valor, as the absence of valor, physical, martial sort of virtues, which Muslims had, which the Nepalis had, which Punjabis had, but not the rest. Bengalis didn't have. Bengali, there is a stereotype of the Bengali called the effeminate Bengali, right? That they are very weak, they have no, they are very malleable, and they submit to authority very quickly, and these kinds of things. So in that context, yes, he is right that there is that strand But I would say that that strand is part of the larger social political type of thing. And indeed, some of the social reformers, they are not of this masculinist ideology. They don't participate in that at all. Rather they are talking about reforms which will bring in civility, and so on. So yeah, so in that sense, yes, there are historical transitions, to be sure, and the masculinist principle that he is identifying, it doesn't end with the 19th century. It doesn't end. Constantly people are challenging. Bhagat Singh, we saw Bhagat Singh, right? Bhagat Singh challenges Gandhi, disagrees with Gandhi, and he is doing so from a kind of left perspective, not from a Hindu perspective like Vivekananda. And Subhash Chandra Bose, he says we should build an army to fight the British and get freedom. And so there are many, and the Hindutva people, the Hindu nationalists, they have the same argument. See, Savarkar, who went to prison and wrote this book on India, he would argue for martial, sort of valor as something that Indians should acquire and should fight to win the freedom and so on. So that element doesn't go away. On the other hand, Ambedkar, who is militantly against Gandhi and everything he stands for, is not militaristic in his thinking at all. He never, he's always believed in, legally sort of bound sort of protest and so on. So you have, different. It's a myth and it's there, but it's not quite this Ardhanarishwara which you were trying to pronounce, right? That word. It's a. In fact, if you go to Bombay, in Bombay, outside Bombay, there's an island called Elephanta. There's an island where there's some rock caves, ancient. In that, you'll find a rock sculpture of Ardhanarishwara. Ardha Nari Ishwara. Right now, if you analyze this, what you have is it's a masculine principle. Half woman, God. This God is male. God is male and incorporates in himself femininity. It's not the other way around, right? Half male goddess. No, there is no such concept. So you can interpret it in whatever way, but this duality is not necessarily a sign of this elevation of exaltation of femininity. It's about mastery of the feminine. Ishwara is Lord, God. So Ardhanarishwara is somebody who is powerful enough to incorporate the feminine in himself. And some feminists would argue that by incorporating the feminine in yourself, you are getting rid of the feminine outside of you. You don't need anymore the women, and so on. So these principles are, I don't know. I mean, they are. There was a certain political value to the androgyny, the femininity question, which is exploiting basically. And if you look at this list of people who, the list of the British, the good people from Britain, it's saying homosexuality and a certain kind of intimacy with the maternal. Right? People who, and this is a constant theme in Ashis Nandy. A lot of people he writes about, it turns out, for whatever reason, that they are all, they slept with their mothers for a long time, were breastfed for a long time, or bedwetters, and had some, psychosexual sort of, so you can say deviance from the norm, heterosexual norm, etc. Now it's sort of if you keep accumulating that kind of evidence, it sort of makes politics itself peculiarly biological in character. Almost like homosexuality or this kind of maternal intimacy, these kinds of things which constitute a psyche seem to be the guarantors of a certain political way of being in later life, which could be a problematic sort of assumption. But Nandy has insisted consistently on this femininity, the feminine principle, this hybridity, the transcending the male and female into a new domain, etc. But the transcendence is not in, as I said, this is the transcendence. This is the only available trope of transcendence, which is a transcendence in which the transcending power is a male power, the Ishvara.
Relate to minor question too. When I read this, the impression I have is the femininity seems to be a regress or not a cure for situation. But at times I feel the conception of femininity is rather stereotypic, because like femininity relates to compassion, things like that. I wonder. For example, in China, I think the traditional culture, femininity may relate to virtues, but it also relate to a lot of vices.
Right, yeah.
I don't know what the kind of situation in India in the traditional culture. How do you conceive femininity?
Well, yeah, see, it is true that, for instance, in India there are a lot of goddesses, female deities who are worshipped and so on. But in the society, there is no marked, sort of privileging of the feminine. There is no evidence of that. In fact, there is a very brutal kind of culture of sexual difference, in which with abuse and suppression and so on. It's neither more nor less, I would think, than any other place, historically speaking, right? But in some ways, in India, it has persisted because our independent existence. There's not been much of a upheaval, socially speaking, social upheavals, which actually modernize, and then there is a certain dip in the conventional patriarchal relations. That has not happened to the same extent, I would say, as in some other places. And so actually you have, so there is a degree of, a high degree of illusion in this construction also, myth making, exactly, as he himself puts it. There is a certain myth making inclination that work.
So he is self-consciously a myth maker.
A myth maker, yeah. That's what invent myth. That's we'll come. The Dipesh Chakravarti brings it up. So let's have Julian's presentation.
So I will present, but it's a short text. So I think I will just make a couple of remarks and in the continuity of the previous discussion, I guess. So when I finished reading this text, I was thinking actually it's a reading of Chakrabarti of Ashis Nandy, but you can feel that it's an historian writing and concerned by the critics of history by Ashis Nandy, especially is insisting on the couple of question practice theory and modernity tradition, and so from what I understood is to criticize the division which will be too strict between practice and theory and modernity and tradition. But then in the detail, it's more, I think we have to go to Ashis Nandy to understand how it could work. And what I say is like what he sees in Ashis Nandy is a problem of a theoretical practice of the historian. So that's what he say around the end when he say like that the clarity of the model is not the same as the clarity of the object for which the model stands. So basically he says thanks to Ashis Nandy, the historian can think about his own categories like recategorize his thought and not take the model he's using to understand an history as the object of his history, like not confuse the object and the model. So for me, it's kind of what I call nominalism. It's like you have terms to describe that you use, but you don't think that you don't take them as the real, as the object that you are studying. They are just instrument of your investigation. So that's for remarks about historian. Because I think this text is mostly, from my understanding, it's mostly about this. It's as an historian. So he began by saying that the problem of self-consciousness is central for Indian intellectual since the middle of the 19th century, and that so Nandy is taken within this problem of self-consciousness, but through the legacy of Gandhi and Swaraj. I say Swaraj because in Swaraj the importance was this question of the self we discussed at the beginning. So like reinvestigation of what the self is and the freedom of the self. And the problem he raised first is the problem of the undesirable past. So which is the problem, like we'll see with the question of sati, but like for the historian, it's both a moral problem, but it's also, as I say, I think it has theoretical consequences. So there is this past that you don't want, or you're undesirable, and you don't know how to deal with. And so Nandy will, I guess, propose a possibility to deal with this undesirable past. So the two options usually relatively to this undesirable past are either you take tradition as inclusion of all the past, or you take tradition, or you use tradition in a way, and you take only some small parts, some bits of it, and which are still conform or can be approved by the present situation. So, but I think with Nandy you see a more complicated picture, even if you can see it's more on the second part, like not taking the tradition as the whole past, but more as some part. But then the problem, I think, is the relation with this part with the present, and what does he mean by present? I think he develops it a bit in the other text, Ashis Nandy, but here it's not developed this question of time. So he described Nandy, or his attitude, as a decisionist. So I don't know, for me, when I hear decisionist, I'm thinking about real politics and the state, and I'm thinking about Carl Schmitt and things like this, because that's my experience of this kind of description. So, but then we can come back on this term of decisionist. Here it's more, it signifies a relation to past and future guided by the present and by the critique of the present. So this decisionist is relative to the past and the future. So it's a decision for the past and the future, which is guided by the critical traditionalism we talk about, so which is a kind of critique of the present. So these are a way of describing our Nandy attitude, or to map his position in the whole field. So this critical traditionalism doesn't mean adulation of past practices, and it doesn't mean either remystification by tradition, which will be only the flip side of the demystification of modernity. So that's not this. So, and it's not a refusal of science and rationality in toto either, but an appreciation of the limitation of objectivity. So he's trying to describe what means is decisionist and critical traditionalism. So in a more moderate way, because from what I understood, he's also defending Ashis Nandy against people who attacked him. So that's also the purpose of the article. And he says like it's also against an ethnocentrism, which for what I understood of his definition is a kind of rough historicism, like using the past for your own objective of the present, basically. Like, so this is what is criticizing and what would mean. But then the decisionist is not so clear for me, so maybe we could discuss more this. So all this, we can see also that they are negative, actually, definition. So it's not this, it's not this. So it's this, but it's not this. So I think that the first part is mostly is the same as the undesirable past. It's some kind of not negative, but thing against what or in front of what Ashis Nandy is working. And the question raised by Ashis Nandy is to historian. From what I understood, it's the main critique Chakravarti is using, is that the problem of a subject of history which cannot talk back. So the historian use a dead subject, like dead people, and they cannot talk back. And so they are constantly alienated by the discourse of history. And that's a core problem of history. And then from this, maybe we can understand also the tonality of Ashis Nandy, the way he's writing, because I guess it has something to do with this. And he mentioned the difference with the revolutionary modernist position, so symbolized by Ambedkar, for example, but I guess also with more different revolutionary from the West, or in India will be Ambedkar. In the relation to the past, so it's still again to describe this decisionist attitude. So in the relation to the past, it's not a rejection of this past or a dialectical overcoming of the past, which these two attitudes will characterize the revolutionary modernist. The revolutionary modernist reject the past, the whole tradition, or try to think more in a Marxist, maybe historical way of writing, a dialectical overcoming, how we could overcome this past. So Ashis Nandy, once again, it's not this. So it's again a negative definition of his decisionism. But what Chakravarti remarks, it's like even if he's different than the revolutionary modernist position, he keeps in his way of writing, in some small part of his text, sometimes it comes out in his work, a relation to the heroic self-invention that had characterized the modern in Europe. So Chakravarti, I don't know if it's a criticism or it's actually something which, I mean, it's a problem he can pose to Ashis Nandy that, but maybe it's not a problem actually, I don't know. But that there is still this heroic self-invention or invention of the self in Ashis Nandy, in this question especially of choice or decision. So this kind of self-inventing subject, which would be more related to the modern subject of Europe, or something which remains from this. So there is something like a rest also. And then he passed more to the question of the theory, which will, I think, put more details in the critiques he made to Ashis Nandy, like thinking about the way Ashis Nandy thinks theory and history. You will see that within Nandy's work, you have actually already answers to the problem Chakravarti himself is asking to Ashis Nandy. I don't know. It's critical, but at the same time, you say it's in Nandy himself you can find the possibility of resolving this problem. So, relatively to history, there is no transparency of the object of investigation. That's what I say at the beginning, and so he praised Ashis Nandy in the way he helps us to deepen our questions in history. So that's the tribute he makes to Ashis Nandy to deepen the question, the historical question. And then he passed on the controversy on the sati, so this young widow killing herself, which I mentioned, which is an example of this undesirable past, and with the ambiguous attitude or like a kind of problem of positioning relatively to this practice. And Nandy tries to raise the tension between the mythology, so appreciation of the value in the sense of Tagore, or in reference to Tagore, that's how Tagore speaks. So this is the mythological part, and the historical. So there is a tension between this mythology, the value, but these are big terms, so I think it should be more elaborated. And the historical which will mean the real practice of the present. So there is a tension, and he described it also with the Indian word he called the event, Gatana, and the system. And I was trying to find another, but for me it seems something like imagination on one side, on the mythological, on the question of the event. It's some relatively to this imagination and the potentialities. I think in the previous text, Chakrabarti is also talking about this necessity of imagination for history. And institutionalization, which will be more this systematic and historical, and that's where, if I understood well, the problem raised. So it seems a bit like the tension between real and ideal and real, but I think we have to be careful. It's not really actually a good way of... I prefer imagination institutionalization than ideal real, because there is no clear distinction, or he doesn't say it, between ideal and real. But it's because he always speaks about ideal, the ideal of the sati, compared to the practice, the real practice. But then I think even this dual ideal real will need to be reconfigured or rethought. And he says, so it is first of all related to the minority position. So this time it's not the undesirable past, but the desire not to be alienated. So this is the position from which Nandy will write and construct his distinction between mythology and history, this tension. So this tension has to come from, so this is problematized from the desire not to be alienated. As I said, like history alienating the subject, for example, because they cannot talk back to this history. So this is one example of alienation. And the problem he raised to Ashis Nandy is like, in a way, Nandy would be overstating the autonomy that we have with respect to the past. So he said he praises respect of the past and the potentialities it can raise, but there is a problem in this decisionism, or the way, because the problem is like it's not Nandy saying I'm a decisionist, it's Chakrabarti describe him as a decisionist, and then he say, but there is problem with your decisionist. So in a way it's Chakrabarti speaking with himself, because it's not Nandy who said I'm a decisionist. So I don't know. There is also a problem in this. I mean, it's Chakrabarti thinking for himself in a way. So you cannot state the autonomy, overstate the autonomy that we have with respect to the past. And he said that we are formed by the past without never knowing it, and it's actually coming out sometime by surprise. And this is this fear of this surprise from the past coming back that we have to pay attention. So we don't have a kind of autonomy regarding the past. We cannot make decision on the past, like which one we want to choose. I think Chakrabarti says more we have to, he's speaking about the anxiety regarding the past or fear. It means like you cannot have a self-conscious, self-eventing perspective on the past, which will be the limit of Nandy's work. If he selects an element of the past for a better future, for an alternative future, but with the idea of an autonomy at the same time of his self regarding this past. So, but at the same time, I think Chakrabarti said that within Nandy, there are ways of not saying he's not totally decisionist also. So I don't know. This question of decisionism is more complicated. I'm not sure I understood well. So there is a limit of the decisionism implied by Nandy's work, and this limit is the obscure ground of each decision regarding the past or the future. So there is this obscure ground. So this is related to theory also, but also to practice. And that's why I think he finished like this, like the dark side of the cultural formation, coming back to the sati case, sati practice. He put it in what we call the dark side. So this is really imaginary. It's more a metaphor. Every cultural formation has a dark side. And he said that this dark side is what Nandy calls pathologies. But he said what Nandy shows us, it's like this dark side are also potentialities, as we said before, of a culture. So the sati can always come back, or any other kind of practice from the past, which we can be judged pathological, can come back, and they will be defined by the dark side. But Chakravarti then speaks more for himself and for production of knowledge, I think, when he said like this dark side is where light cannot pass. So and this, I think, this is a way of defining the condition of historical knowledge and its limit at the same time. So this is the dark side, where we cannot see, where the light cannot pass, where it's not clear. That's exactly the starting point of knowledge, and it's at its condition. That's where history begins, actually. And I put at the end because it made me think to an historian on which I work. He's called Paul Venn, and he talked about history like this, and he compared it with an iceberg. And so this dark side is a bit the immersed part of the iceberg. He said, like, when we do history, we have actually the emerged part of the iceberg. So we see 10% actually of all the practice. And this 10%, we build an historical object from this 10%. And we think the transformation only from this 10%, like the historical transformation only from this 10% of the iceberg. While actually the real transformation occurs in the dark side, in the invisible part, in some small practice, invisible, which change and which transform. So I think I think he's working on the same line of historical epistemology or methodology. I don't know how to call it. So yeah, so when you see, like, in a way, Nandy will help to look into this dark side more than it's defending the dark side of history. I don't know. So that's it. And so yeah, but I say like Ashis Nandy can help to pay attention to the practice rather than the objectivation of this practice in a theoretical discourse. So always be careful with the objectification and more coming back to the practice themselves. So in the sati will be more the question of value or the ideal to understand this practice. But that's where I see the relation between myth and history, which anyway doesn't work. It's more the tension which works.
Yeah, I mean these are the 3 or 4 terms which Julian has highlighted, which are most important for Dipesh Chakravarti's evaluation of the Nandy program as a whole, right? That's what he's doing. So first of all, there is in the text a defense of Nandy, which is on the idea that there is a respect for tradition, which is contrasted with those intellectual tendencies which seek to sort of treat the past as good or bad and only sort of mark a break between the past and the present, right? And everything in the past is then condemned as obsolete, feudal, evil, or whatever. In that sense, the idea that you actually treat the past with a certain respect, that is, you don't assess or evaluate the past according to what you believe now, your values today. That is important. And that's where he defends Nandi against those who cannot see that when he turns his eye towards Sati, and when he says that, Sati in the old days was a matter of honor, that was, it implied an ideal of womanhood and so on. He is not necessarily recommending it for today's women. He's saying, okay, you recognize the sovereignty of the past vis-a-vis itself, right? It had its own. It was a world. You historically evaluate it. Now it doesn't mean that you endorse it, but you. So Nandi, also quotes Tagore, who for instance celebrates. Now Tagore is certainly not is a very secular-minded poet and intellectual, but he would glorify the satis of old, saying that that was a world of honor. Like if you read Deleuze's work, he will celebrate a certain kind of medieval sort of what he calls the rhizomatic, sort of where for instance all these knights fighting and these Genghis Khan killing everybody from one end of the world to another. All these are part of a certain kind of world of honor and bravery and valor, etc., which is valorized. So in a way, it's a different type of thing, right? So the point is that on that score, he is defending Nandi. But where he is critical of Nandi, the decisionism and the failure to, they are related. See, the decisionism critique is carried through to the end. He starts by saying it's decisionist, then he defends Nandi first of all, and then he returns to the decisionist. Okay. So what is the, decisionism basically means it's correct because I say so. This is decisionism. Decisionism is not a, for instance, in today's world, a philosopher who proclaims himself as a decisionist is Alain Badiou. Yeah, he clearly says, I know I'm a decisionist. Decisionism is the need of the hour, he says, right? It's a particular approach to philosophy and politics. Now, in Nandi's case, the decisionism is that you take the past and you say what you think is right about it. You just, decide that this is what it means, and these are the values, these are the meanings of the past, of the past, of the present, everything. So that is where it's related to voluntarism. There's another word which occurs in the last is voluntarism. A way in which you can say that Gandhi wanted to do this and he did that and it happened like that. As if it's all about, wanting and, it will happen and so on, right? Voluntarism is a type of thinking which attributes historical agency to individuals without social context and other things intervening, which is very much a characteristic of Nandi's way of treating Gandhi. Gandhi was this agency free of all determinations, who just has ideas and implements them. And history unfolds because of these decisions. That's the voluntaristic. Now, both these are related to the final point that Dipesh Chakravarti is making, which is, for Nandi, there are no dark spots in history. That's why he says that Nandi uses the word dark, but he means something else. He says, I want to redefine dark. I think I want to redefine dark as those areas of the past where you cannot see very well. So what do you do when you can't see the past very well? You say, oh, it could be like this, maybe this is what it means, but it's not clear whether this could be the meaning. The historian's discourse will change. When you see a dark spot, you'll say, if you want to see the dark spot, you'll say, well, this is unfortunately an area where it's not possible to say anything more. because we don't have the evidence and because we don't know what the meanings might and so on. This very gesture of withdrawal of this interpretive will, the will to knowledge, which encounters a limit in the dark spots, right? So what he is pointing to is that in Nandi there are no such dark spots. For him, everything is transparent.
I thought
In this,
you call it the pathologies or the dark.
No, the
Side.
pathology, but pathology is also very transparent. He knows what is pathological and what is healthy. So actually Dipesh Chakravarti is saying, you use the word dark, but let me use the word dark in another sense and show you something about your work. Because what he says is there is a dark side to history, but he knows the dark side also, which is all these pathologies of colonialism. So everything is completely transparent to Nandi's gaze. Nothing, there are no obscure corners, there is no dark spots, there is no hidden things, there's nothing hide, there's no bush behind which something may be there, or the discourse. If you just read Nandi's writing, he is never at a loss for words. Saying, he never says, maybe this is what Gandhi meant. No. He says, this is what Gandhi meant. And I am not going to give you proof because it's all about myth making. Right? So, that kind of a thing. It's a particular stance he adopts, a decisionist, voluntarist stance, and omniscient, all seeing. So in other words, it is not a voice that is held back by some difficulty. So that's what I think he is pointing to. But in the process, what Nandi is doing, according to Chakravarti, is that he is also challenging certain kinds of rigid and ritualistic practices of the left thinking, which is too evaluative in its relation to the past, right? Too much sort of habituated to judging the past by the criteria of the present, and not being able to allow the past its autonomy. Yeah. So that aspect, insofar as Nandi is a provocateur, who points, highlights this problem of Indian intellectual discourse. That's where he is defending. But he is also recommending. He is advocating to Nandi a certain modesty of claims. Which is, so in other words, as you rightly said, he is a historian's concern. That is, he is saying you can't escape the historical character of your own discourse by simply saying in a decisionist way, I am just a myth maker. Because you are constantly citing historical evidence. You are saying this happened then and this happened here, and your every thinking is shot through and through by historicity, right? The historical data as they are, what are all these things? They are produced by historians. In 1857 this happened, something happened, and in 19 something else happened. This is historical already, right? So you are thinking with it, and once you get into historical discourse, you are faced with the problem of the iceberg phenomenon, which is that the archival evidence is only some minor residue of something else, of what actually happened. So you have to be sensitive to that limitation, right? That's the thing. And what was the other? There was that. The whole point of that heroic self-invention is, that passage. Actually, what he is also saying is, apart from defending Nandi's way of respect for the past, that is one. But the other thing is, he is saying, he calls himself a critical traditionalist, but he is a thoroughly modern intellectual. That's what he is establishing. So this is also directed at the critics of Nandi, because critics of Nandi think that since he is defending Sati, he is a anti-modern kind of person. So first he wants to establish that he is a modern intellectual who is heroic inventor. So that very heroism of thought, where you with the sheer we feel that with the sheer power of thought you can actually invent and create new futures. This is very modern. That's what he's saying. So Nandi as an intellectual is a thoroughly modern figure. There is nothing. His critical traditionalism is a particular way of understanding his own practice, but as a practitioner, as a persona, he is thoroughly modern. My feeling about that, and because I feel it is an important question, and it has been a concern of mine to talk about this, and I feel that having done this critique, you should go on to talk about this precisely. What makes it possible? You have to then be able to explain the historicity of this position itself. And there you have to get into certain philosophical questions of the subject-object, sort of subject-substance, if you want to put it in Hegelian terms, the relation of subject and substance, the relation of subject and object, etc., where precisely, see, the one established convention for dividing subject from object is the European Convention, right, which is embodied in the disciplines, right. There is some way in which subject and object is divided, and it's a very neat division. As long as you inhabit a European sort of academic intellectual milieu, philosophical sort of discursive milieu, it's a very well established, familiar, and sort of long standing distinction, right? People understand it, people know what it is, etc. The social sciences will through in the methodological sort of discourses of the social sciences, it's elaborated, right, and so on. Now, for colonized people, this particular system of subject-object or subject-substance division is already a difficult one to inhabit. And the classical site on which that difficulty manifests itself dramatically is anthropology, right? In anthropology, you have the problem of where instead of things, instead of worlds, people are the object. So it immediately sort of scrambles the subject-object distinction in interesting, difficult ways, right? And this is one of this Ramanujan, whose essay we read, has a story, very interesting story. I think I might have mentioned it before, which is called Annaya's Anthropology. It's a very paradigmatic story, which captures some of these things. It's basically about a Hindu Brahmin young man from India who goes to Chicago as a student. There's a lot of complications, but I'll just leave out all that and just give you what is of essence to us, or of interest to us. In Chicago, he is looking at the journals of anthropology, and he finds an article on Brahmin Dipesh Chakravarti, for instance, the contrast is Dipesh Chakravarti can say what he wants to say while remaining within the conventions of subject-object distinction established by the global academy. Ashis Nandy cannot do it. Simply that kind of separation, that kind of positioning vis-a-vis the object is unavailable to Ashis Nandy and to many people. That's why if you look at Indian intellectual production, people are in the academy, but the academic writing will be suddenly there are these eruptions of anger, judgment, these kinds of things are, the academic piece will be bristling with these kinds of elements. It can't be it's restive. It can't be at peace with this knowledge thing because it's not possible. Yeah?
But then I'm trying to understand the situation. So people like Ashis Nandy would ally him with the Gandhian or Tagore. These are not academics, right? These are not academic practice.
No, exactly. That itself is a sign of a particular something which exceeds the academic.
Yes.
Right.
So in other words, he occupies certain academic space.
Yeah.
But he used that academic space to continue the
Exactly.
decisionist.
Yeah.
I understand decisionist in that sense, in the sense that with whatever he has to say, he wants to connect to the lower caste movement and so on, or even sometimes the risk of speaking for them.
Right.
Where Deepak didn't have to do it.
No, but that's where the problem is. See, the problem is highlighted here.
Yeah.
That is, you can't help speaking like that, and yet that is precisely your problem. So the choice is, the two choices available are both problematic. One is to simply go and occupy the already ready-made objectivity, conventions of the West. The other is to completely be, unable to exit from this thing. So in other words, what you need is to be able to generate a subject-object distinction within your own political space by a clear cut, which can then harmonize with other objectivities. That doesn't matter. But you have to be able to produce that distinction in a way, within your space, which means universal subject position, right? Unless there is universal citizenship, this can't happen, right? The distinction, because some people will be always spoken for. Either Nandi will speak for them or somebody else will speak for them. So you are in terms, you're producing that problem of the anthropological problem within yours. So while you are being subjective in a very extreme fashion, the problem of expressive, representation. You see, one thing is an American cannot represent Americans, but an Indian always assumes that representative status. A voice like Nandi's is a voice that says, "I know the truth. I represent India adequately," right? And that always will encounter problems. People will challenge it. So there are problems which, so these two extremes are where we are positioned. Unable to sort of reconcile the two in some kind of locally viable subject-object distinction, right? Which will then, well, maybe the question of the Taiwan and colonialism, that's, I would like to hear more about it, if anybody has anything to offer.
A question, because if you say actually is a cultural, critical traditionalist, there are people in Taiwan or China who could depend for such kind of critical traditionalism, but doesn't
Does it fit actually?
Let me try help me out in relation to this. I think people don't talk about it, but in that sense, Nandy is a unique case, and he himself understands he is a modern. Right?
Yeah.
Right, but he claimed. I think he's trying to open, in a way, if you want to be sympathetic, he's trying to open to whatever past practices or myths right, as resources.
Yeah.
Right. But in the Chinese instance, you also get polarized. Right. You're either completely traditionalist, and some people you can live your entire life like a Taoist, without sort of within the vocabulary of the Taoist tradition, without so that's one choice. Or the other would be completely so-called, and which Deepak suggested, I think quite interesting. It's legitimate to be a westernized Indian.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Right.
That's true.
Whereas here people are a little bit suspicious. Completely westernized. I think that would be my
right,
without
okay.
a sense of confidence, like Deepak would say. I'm completely westernized, but they would say this is no other choice, or and so on for other argument. Right? But his views seem to be you're open to the past resources, whatever you want to call it, solution. Right?
Yeah.
But pulling out certain elements, that's in that sense myth-making, in the sense whether you can do that. Right? But there has always been argument that you pulled out the good things and push aside the bad things.
Right.
And that has always been the rhetoric being put forward. So in that sense, you can understand him in dialogue with even with the real traditionalists, and trying to say you need to be more critical, because the traditionalists can also be very, very how should I say, hierarchically against the illiterate, class or whatever, right? But as a modern person, you probably need to empower these, given what they have as a condition of living, to whatever resources they have to empower them. I think that's one way to understand what Nandy is trying to do in dialogue with those. So there are many points of a dialogue or enemy to work with, but these are critical. It's not a popular notion of a critical. Maybe Xinjia, I don't know. He's a neo-Confucianist. They try to connect with the usually Confucians and modernize it in terms of concrete things like marriage and so on and so forth. And he's actually in that institute, which is the basis for neo.
Okay.
There is a whole school or whole intellectual, even by now a movement of trend to. I think it's also with the rise of China. For instance, this is the pressure. If you don't have that, what are you?
Right.
That's the pressure. So there is certain sentiment, I think, shared, but whether it's played out exactly the same way, or I don't know. I mean, so in that sense, you have Nandy a confidence in vis-a-vis. Probably, I don't know. You have to be confident enough to tell the third party being in dialogue with the Orthodox left. But otherwise, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
As a public figure, I think he's this is how I understand your dialogue with your opponent to perform for the third party who's watching.
Yeah.
Right? Which is the public audience or something. So I don't know, maybe philosopher?
I think in Taiwan, in an academy, the traditionalists and critical tradition, one can just segregate, the modernists.
Mm-hmm.
And the critical traditionalists, for example, the new Confucian you were talking about, are using Western philosophy like Kant and so on to explicate the traditional Chinese philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And the traditionalists just doing their own thing, which I don't understand. So in a sense, we don't have Ashis Nandy. I assume his work is read by modernists, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think we have a whole lot of people like that. The Neo-Confucianists, quite a few of them were America-based. They're teaching in Columbia or Harvard. Yeah, right. But
we also have the
right, but still, I don't think general Westernized intellectuals can read them. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. They remain kind of enclave. Mm.
What I find fascinating in your last 10 minutes statement.
I think because there's a language barrier.
Yeah.
I think the main reason, language barrier. We cannot understand, right? Because we're reading the ancient text, where we can. We cannot understand.
Okay.
I think that's a base of thing.
Okay. So it becomes a kind of sinology branch or something like that.
Right. Like just we cannot read Sanskrit, so then that becomes a specialized area of study.
But if I return the question to you, you think that's not, how should I say, Deepak's position, it occupies certain position like, different from Nandy. But your argument, I think, is profound in the sense that unless some condition change, right?
Mm.
So you become a either or.
Yeah. That's the thing. So the struggle to produce academic discourse of the kind that is produced in the West is a constant effort in India, because the institutions are built like that. But it's constantly falling short of it, because it can never aspire to that for various reasons. Incompetence is also one thing, but also this particular, sort of, especially in the humanities circles, that the subjective keeps the jumping into the at all the sort of thing. And this is, for instance, something you can see in the Dalit critiques. For instance, there are two kinds. One will do objective social statistical or ethnographic analysis and show the conditions under which Dalits are living and all that. That's one. The other will make these kinds of Nandy type of subjectively charged sort of proclamations, based on literary or other kinds of examples and history, and same way of relating to history or Ambedkar, etc. So these positions of knowledge are very much set for some time to come, it seems, unless, as I said.
And probably, I'm sorry, you people who talk. In a way, it's probably that decisionism or something we share with them, right? And in a way, because the issue he would tackle related to us, relevant to us.
Okay.
Not necessarily the answer he provides.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I see what you mean.
Whereas, I don't know what. Let's cut the other end. These decisions, if I may turn it around, if we put them into the, let's say, European American context, these decisions tend to be. These are also minority, right? By now, I would say the leftover Marxists, right, or feminists. Even by now, certain more emerging these queer scholarship and so more in tune with this line of art.
Right.
But these are very small population, right, which occupy certain position within the academy. But in a way, I guess to push your argument to the limit is trying to suggest that these people actually don't belong there. That's not what institution. No, I'm serious. This is not what the institution structured that. Right? You are a scientist. I mean, if I can be simplistic about it, right? I mean, this is how 18th century university was built. The dominant forces were probably the natural sciences people. And by that, in that sense, the humanity, I don't know how do they do. I mean, that's another matter. These social sciences were completely shaped in dialogue with the natural sciences.
Absolutely.
Right? So you have developed certain methodology, right? Stratification study, sociology, or something along this line, which as soon as you can hide your emotion, right? I mean, but you cannot display that. Right? You cannot even use first-person pronoun. All these, I think, institutionalized practice. But this is a simplistic understanding. If that's that, right? But somehow, I think you're talking about some different condition. Because in a way, this professionalization of the post-1990, trying to do that.
Yeah.
Remove that. But the problem is, I don't know if it's a generation problem or not. Because they try to evacuate. That's what you try to say. I mean, this is the international strata system. You occupy there, and you shut up what you're not supposed to say once you're disturbed. Something. And that's also going on. But I guess what I want to say is, you don't find those works interesting. This is a tragedy. Right? Then you find these decisions more relevant or connected to, if you wish, sort of local surrounding your sort of part of it.
That's true.
Right.
And that's why you want to use the notion of a cultural study, because that authorizes you.
Yeah, exactly. No, the problem I am referring to is the symptoms of it are not restricted to the decisionists or anything like that. For instance, it can apply to Dipesh also, in the sense when in the American Academy, he won't automatically fall into the objective, conventions established there. He will himself be wriggling under the gaze of that, because for instance, post-colonialism, the practitioners of post-colonialism traditionally in the 80s, 90s used to come across as Indians speaking for India, right, in the same way. So it's a symptom of a particular arrangement which can manifest itself in Nandy as much as in Dipesh or in me or in some other person in different sites on different time at different times, etc. So it is a sign of a certain kind of problem in the works, as it were. The machinery is has these spots which don't seem to be well defined. Because there is one, so that's the thing, the overwhelming dominance of that one well-defined thing, the European sort of, sort of set of conventions, always generates as a response a kind of radical subjectivism. Or an attribution of subjectivity even where the practice is an objectivist one. So what is not, in my opinion, what is not happening is the examination of the very, very conditions of knowledge. So for instance, the ease with which Indian intellectuals assume the validity of this global sort of knowledge systems way of dividing subject and object is not because the reason is absent from it. Its practices do generate knowledge which we use. But there seems to be a way in which the new subject of a new nation has to find a habitation which is made for that subject, right? In some kind of way. There has to be a registration. That is, you have to become a member, as it were, consciously. Even if it's a global, system of knowledge, your membership should be an event. It should happen, not just simply slide into existing, sort of positions in a kind of unregistered, unmarked way. That's what is happening now. So that's then it has its complement in these eruptions of decisionism or voluntarism or whatever, and especially the tendency to speak for in that absolute way, right? So one can even ask whether that kind of a speech is the sign of one is not free to be oneself, as it were. One must always be an Indian. In the sense, you are automatically inscribed into an Indian identity. That is, the collective identity dominates, in all sort of spheres of life. That is, especially in the encounter with the other. So these are some of the, if you just describe the symptoms, these are some of the things that seem to be.
No, but I was thinking that, I don't know, but Ashis Nandy showed actually that Ashis or Jankala actually that the history, like any modern history, is also a mythology. So it has been created to justify the need of the present.
Sure. See, that's again, as I said, the practice and the theory. This is characteristic of modern, these discourses that begin in the modern era, that they are characterized by a split between the theory and the practice. So, theory or something. So, something which is independent of practices. Practices, historical practices, yes, everybody writes history to defend something or to oppose something. And to create, real or imagined, interpret things in such a way as to favor one view as against another, etc. Right? This is history writing. But there is another, what is the event that we are talking about, which generates these ideological practices of history? It is the advent of history itself. That is, the idea that the world is not under the watchful eye of God. No, this is the event. That is where history, that's another kind of history which comes into existence. Once you know that what we are today is because of somebody was, it was yesterday, and that what we do today will affect what will happen tomorrow. This idea, this kind of, you are existentially, ontologically oriented towards a historical perception of your own place in the world, your society, your life, everything, right? This is a new thing. It It is barely 200 years old, 200-300 years old, right? It is new. It makes a big difference to lives. That is what Claude Lefort calls it the fall into history. You suddenly jump out of the sky and fall into history.
That's a myth.
Huh?
That's exactly as say bring as a myth, because when you talk the fall into history, it's like the fall of Adam and Eve. So you take again.
No, but it's a metaphorical way of putting it. That is what you want to convey. He uses it's a phrase with a metaphorical charge. But what it means is that if you look at your world today, the new modern nation states, they are assuming historical time as the time in which we live. It is sharply contrasted with just the time before that, in which everybody assumed that you lived in a time in which the church represented God's kingdom on earth. Right? It has concrete sort of.
So that's why I'm wondering, because this didn't disappear. The church, the God perspective is still within the story. So, I mean, the myth is to say that there is a rupture actually, but there are a lot of continuity.
No, continuity there will be. Continuity is different from the advent of something new. The advent of something new means an open sky where there is no heaven inhabited by people. This is something new. It is new. Everything changes. I mean, there's not the only, there are lots of many other things also happen. For instance, enumeration. Suddenly, this completely, what seemed to people at the time, the absurd practice of counting everybody as one. Somebody has no legs, they are still one. Somebody is about to, they're like lying in the deathbed, but if they are alive, they are counted as one. You see, the counting of people, regardless of ability or status or whatever, this population idea. In the kingdom of God, there is no need for population counting. Right? You don't count populations in the kingdom of God. Populations are counted only in the historical time. Right? So like that, there is a whole series of things that come into newly come into being, I mean, otherwise what is modern? What is the difference? There is no difference? Is that?
No, I mean, to me it's like the fact that history is not kind of new mythology, and using actually old tools, because what like the history which is created just after this supposed rupture, what you see in history, it's actually the perspective they have from God, or they imagine from God. They take it and they say, okay, the historian is more or less taking this position.
No, but that itself is a big difference. What only God could see, now the historian claims to see. Now this is a change, isn't it? I mean, that you can actually, historian can actually claim such omniscience, isn't it? I mean, it's a.
For me, the story has the same structure actually. That's why like continuity, like Europe, or is still like completely embedded is in a Christian history for a certain number of things, especially.
See, everything will be embedded in whatever went before it, in the sense that precisely because it's not a divine intervention, it cannot be a clean new thing, right? It has to come from. That's why, what we know today as modern history, medicine, etc., they all come from Europe. Because Europe is where the modern, happened as an event. But it's now everywhere in the world, right? But it's still associated with Europe, right? So in Europe, whatever the church was there, that is obviously a way in which there is a continuity with the church and other things that existed, the feudal absolutist state and other things. They will have some role to play. The English Revolution of the previous century, and so on. So, the provenance is not a provenance that is where something happened, where it came from, and continuity of certain discursive elements is not an argument against the novelty of the phenomenon, because what the novelty of the phenomenon has to be judged by what changes in the world, what new things happen in the world which could not have happened before. So the Cartesian moment, just to presume this completely disembodied or subject of knowledge, who has only this thought as the basis. This is a new possibility which only the modern can, which is part of the becoming modern of the world. I mean, it's mixed up with mythology. This is different, but one is trying to sort of sift and see what is there nevertheless. Because see, when you say all that is mythology, and when I say what I am saying, no, I'm just pointing out something. When you say that and when I say what I am saying, we are both assuming the possibility of saying something that is true about something else, right? That means we are assuming a position in reason. So from that position in reason, what I am saying is that you can see the continuities, the mixtures, the persistence of Christianity, the origins in absolutism, and all of these kinds of things, and see the disruption, the novelty, the sheer unprecedented character, etc. It's an attempt to see that. So it's like that. So mythology, yes, but where can you reduce it to a complete sort of there's like a is there a big wave or is there a ripple when the modern happens, right? So the modern is a big event which generates multiple novelties, transforms the world in different ways, or is it simply a little thing which left?
I would say it's a lot of small events,
right,
which connected, but it's not the big event. That
no, not big. But what about retrospectively? Has it changed the world?
yeah, but the world changed. Whatever, the world changed before what we call modern too. It's just we have the myth of this change. I don't know. Maybe myth is not a good term because it refers to the wrong thing.
So is this Paul Bain think like that?
I don't know, but me more and more. Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay.
I don't know. But for this model, for me, it's a lot of small events. It's not.
No, they are of course small events. There's one thing here, one thing there. Everything doesn't happen in one place, because to be big, it would all have to happen one place. But since they all happen in the small different places, they're obviously they constitute. Yeah. Well, it's I mean, obviously some of these judgments are based on the archival record, which, as we said, is just the tip of the iceberg. But if you look at how people are looking at, if you look at the trials of Galileo, for instance, right? These are the moments in history where this new and old are confronting themselves. They are events of some kind which get inscribed in a human history as significant events, because at that time they saw it as significant. Both sides saw it as significant, right? They saw it as a fight between some two, in a mythical fight between, the church and science and so on.